It's week 2 and it's all about empathy and compassion. Well, Richard, it's been a very interesting week this week, and lots of really valuable insights, I think, especially around the areas of empathy and compassion. And in some ways, it's a bit of a challenging week for many learners, well, for every human being, really.
It's definitely challenging.
Yeah.
You know what I've found really interesting this week? A lot of our learners have started to notice the physical difference, the felt experience, the difference between empathy and compassion. I mean, it makes sense as a concept, but this course particularly, people have been really noticing that empathic resonance can sometimes feel, because we're feeling the distress of the other person, so it can feel a little bit like stress or anxiety or distressing emotions, whereas once we start practicing compassion, it actually feels very different in the body, which I thought was fascinating.
Totally different emotional responses are cultivated in compassion. And also, even in the presence of distress and empathy without anything else, just feeling somebody else's pain is important to understand where somebody might be. But if that's all we're left with, then we're left with our own stress response as well, which doesn't help us. And very often the responses that arise from that are not necessarily useful for the other person either.
No, that's right. It's actually pain centers in the brain that light up when we're resonating with someone's suffering. So it's very interesting. Yeah.
So when we cultivate compassion, there's totally different emotional centers that are activated. And so empathy is perhaps a first step, but we don't want to stop there.
It's part of it, isn't it? But there's that extra step, which is actually really useful.
Yeah. And so, yes, they were very interesting observations. And also many noticed that the cultivation of compassion was energizing.
Yes.
And it led to some very constructive responses. Although there may be times when there's nothing we can do, we're just aware of somebody's difficulties and it's far removed and we can't do anything about it, but nevertheless we can still cultivate compassion.
Yeah.
But many found that it was actually quite empowering and energizing.
Well, I really liked one of our learners noticed that when they were sitting there doing the meditation, suddenly they thought of practical things that they could actually go and do to ease one of their friends' suffering, which was great.
Yeah. The sense of control came up as well, that feeling more in control. And to some extent, I think that compassion helps us to do that. But just to remember, of course, there's the inner and outer control. We can't always control what's going on around us. We can't always change things whatever way we think they should be. But always control of our inner attitude to whatever's going on around us.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing, is that through mindfulness, we can learn to be not necessarily dominated by every thought or feeling or attitude that might arise, and we can positively cultivate the ones that we want to.
Yes. I also read that question a little bit like, is empathy sort of not being in control? Because in a sense, we are sitting in primary emotions.
Yeah.
And if we're feeling into someone's sadness or someone's fear and anxiety, and then the compassion, as that extra step, at least making wishes, if not doing something to alleviate that, I guess it does in a way perhaps give us a sense of control.
Yeah.
And that's related to another interesting query, that is compassion perhaps a little bit more removed than empathy? And someone asked, is it more appropriate to use compassion professionally, perhaps as a doctor or a psychologist, and empathy in personal relationships? And that's a very interesting question, isn't it?
Well, I kind of think compassion always. But
empathy and compassion always.
Yeah,
yes.
But it might express itself in different ways in different relationships.
Yeah.
Of course, professional or personal, etc. So there might be an appropriate expression of it that might be inappropriate in another situation. But I think always. It's an interesting, the so-called the sage's morning prayer, and this comes from an Eastern tradition, but every morning wise sages recite the kind of thoughts, may all be happy, may all be without disease, may all creatures have well-being, and none be in misery of any sort. And now, obviously...
Sounds suspiciously like a loving-kindness meditation, doesn't it?
It does. You cultivate that as a way you step into the day. And obviously, there will be suffering in the world, but at least we know which direction we're heading in.
Yes.
And to minimise that for self, but of course for others as well.
Yeah, and on the subject of wisdom traditions, if you dig into some of them as well, compassion comes ultimately from a recognition that we're connected with one another, that we're not isolated islands floating around, that we're all interconnected with each other, with other animals, other beings, with the earth. And once we feel that connection, then someone else's suffering, in a sense, is our suffering.
That's right.
And that's why that urge to relieve it just naturally arises. So far from being a sort of a disconnected thing, it's actually a radical connection.
That's right. when we do have that sort of sense of oneness, then compassion is the natural state, which kind of leads into the next thing about perhaps it being phony. Are we trying to cultivate or put something on? And
when we're cultivating a sense of kindness and compassion, is it a bit fake or phony or artificial?
And I guess that's a legitimate comment. But if, for example, the compassion is the natural state, but a whole lot of other stuff gets in over the top, covers it, obscures it, distorts it, etc., so that we experience anger and vengeance, etc.,
jealousy and disconnection,
all sorts of stuff. So, in a sense, we're learning to undo those habitual, unhelpful patterns of thought and feeling.
I think that's a fantastic point. So it's not that we're creating a state of compassion or empathy or kindness, but we're rediscovering our own innate state. So in that way, it's the opposite of artificial, isn't it? It's getting rid of the stuff that is, in a sense, artificial and getting back to what's real.
Yeah, removing those impediments, as it were. And so in terms of the phrasing as well, there was some interesting discussions around that.
Well, in these meditations, like you said, there's that sage's prayer. There are loving kindness meditations with classic kind of wishes. May you be happy. May you be well. But really, because it's about rewiring the brain and cultivating or let's say rediscovering an innate attitude of kindness, we can use any wish we like. And a lot of our learners noticed that, may I live with ease was one that somebody found really helpful. So we can feel free to add in any wish we like, as long as it's just cultivating that sense of goodwill and kindness. And also the may I and may you is good, because at the moment I say I am happy, some part of my brain goes, well, not completely happy, so I start to get in an argument, but as an aspiration, may I be happy, may I be well, it kind of gets past that. So I think it's actually very skillful language.
And of course, the mind's usual language is I ought to be, I've got to be, I should be, and all of a sudden there's this kind of internal struggle where we're just presenting it as perhaps a possibility, rather than an imposition, which, of course, brings up much more resistance.
Yes. And looping back around to what you said a moment ago, another learner noticed that when they're practicing mindfulness, even though it's called being mindful, there's actually no mind there in the sense of thoughts and concepts. And in a sense, they started to notice that perhaps thinking gets in the way of being in the heart. And that makes me think of Jon Kabat-Zinn talking about how mindfulness could just as easily be called heartfulness, and how perhaps when we get out of all of our habitual habits, these things that separate us from others, like, being caught in frustrated, angry, jealous, whatever thoughts, concepts and ideas, and drop into what's real, we do naturally just start to become heartful, compassionate and kind.
And we have to be very aware. I mean, we see somebody and there might be just a natural connection, but then how quick the mind is to come in, they're a such and such person. And all of a sudden we start
concepts and ideas about them,
project stuff onto them, biases, assumptions, and all sorts of things. And pretty soon that's and if we're not mindful, we don't see that that's actually taking place.
Yeah. Now, Craig, these ideas are all well and good, but a lot of us are about to go into the holiday season, and probably spend extended periods of time with family, drinking wine, eating lots. So how does this apply in those situations?
Well, enjoyment and being present and in the moment, festive season, all of that sort of thing is very good. But sometimes we'll be confronted by difficult situations.
Yes.
And I guess the expansion of compassion is not just to a few people that I like, but to also include people that we sometimes find difficult, to include people that maybe just a general sense of compassion, even if we don't know people. And so I think this is important, but at very least, not to practice the revenge meditation or the judgment and criticism meditation, which is
hating-unkindness meditation.
It's a very powerful form of meditation, and the mind will just go over and over some previous slight and so on.
But that has certain effects, doesn't it, on the physiology, on the body?
Regardless of anybody else, if we're observing what's happening in ourselves, we can feel it, the anger and hostility, and that has effects in shortening our telomeres and lowering our life expectancy and bringing forward chronic illnesses. It has effects on our immunity, so anger increases inflammation.
Increased heart attacks and heart disease associated with anger.
So when we practice these kind of things like compassion, it has an anti-inflammatory effect, takes stress off the system, and is actually good from an aging point of view. So at very least, with an enlightened self-interest, we could stop harming ourselves.
So if we find ourselves sitting at the dinner table having a sort of a holiday festive season lunch, and we find ourselves getting annoyed with someone, maybe we could just notice the effect that's having on us and let go of that judgment or that resentful thought or that grudge that we have, even out of compassion for ourselves, if not for the other person.
Yeah, because we're probably not seeing ourselves. We can be pretty difficult, I dare say, ourselves at times. So I think we're all in the same boat as the rest of humanity.
So on that note, next week, self-compassion.
Yeah, so self-compassion, we're working more in this sort of area and being compassionate and kind towards others. So we'll be cultivating this even further. But just to remember that this is not always easy. So you go at your own pace. Yeah. You practice the exercises and experiments you feel comfortable to practice. And obviously, if things arise that are quite difficult, then of course, seek some help and support professionally if you ever feel like you need it.
Yeah. A lot of our learners actually who repeat these courses find that maybe in the beginning they skipped a couple of these exercises because it was just too much, but then they've come back later on, perhaps with a little bit more mindfulness or a bit more life experience, and then they found it very useful.
Yeah. So we'll look forward to being with you next week, and between now and then, have a very mindful week.